Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for your participation in today, our inaugural coffee and KT. My name is Janine Mohammed. I am the interim CEO here at Lowitja Institute. I'm an Arungagana woman, and as such, I would like to begin by acknowledging the country that we're meeting on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Cullen Nation. And of course, I extend that respect to all of the First Nations lands that you're coming to us from. I also want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course our future emerging generations. And I wish you well in today's webinar. I'll hand over to Alex for further facilitation.
Thank you, Janine. So you may have all noticed that I've got you all on mute. Apologies for that, but the way that Zoom works, if I don't, any noise that you make will then take the focus away from the presentation. And also at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see that you've got a chat button. If you could open that, that would be wonderful. And while I'm going through the agenda, if there's anyone online that would like closed captioning, if you could please let us know, as we've got our comms manager, Christina, here, who's gratefully offered to do closed captions should they be needed. So going into the agenda for today, as I said, if we could just keep everyone muted while we do the presentations, I will then facilitate the unmuting of when we come to the question and answers period at the end. So we'll do presentations for about the first hour, followed by Q&A session for about the second hour. If you have any questions during the presentations, if you could please just indicate this via the chat function. If you just send through the letter Q or something like that, I'll then be able to keep a log of who's indicated they'd like to ask a question. And then once both the presentations are done, I'll invite you to pose your question to the presenters and enter into a discussion from there. Also, once we're finished with the presentations and questions and answers, there'll be a short evaluation poll at the end. It would be greatly appreciated if you could answer those. I think it's 3 or 4 questions. And also, if you have any additional feedback that's not covered by the poll, absolutely, please feel welcome to send that through to my email address. That would be greatly appreciated. Before we get into things, it has been a little while since we did our pilot. That was back in September. So if we do have any technical issues, I apologise in advance and thank you for your patience. But I'm pretty confident that we've put in enough work leading up to this to sort of iron out those creases. So in acknowledgement of tomorrow being International Women's Day, for our Lowitja funded projects we're looking at showcasing, we thought we'd look at our gender-based projects. So we have 2 presenting today. Well, firstly, we'll have Associate Professor Alice Rumbold and Miss Courtney Hammond from University of Adelaide. They'll be presenting from the perspective of their project titled Reclaiming Strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Identities Through a Gender Equity Lens. Following them, we have Dr. Patricia Cullen from the George Institute for Global Health, UNSW, and School of Public Health and Community Medicine at UNSW, and Dr. Marlene Longbottom from Australian Health Services Research Institute at the University of Wollongong. So I'll now just pass over to the presenters.
My name is Connie Hammond, and before we begin, I would like to personally acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. We thank you for welcoming us onto these lands and for allowing us to present our research. We acknowledge and respect the Wurundjeri people as the original custodians of this land and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which our research was conducted, the Kaurna, Barngarla and Ngarrindjeri peoples. We respect their relationship with the land and we thank them for welcoming us into their communities and for supporting us throughout the entirety of the study. I am an Eastern Arunta Tjinjanakol woman with ties to country in the lower southeast of South Australia with the Boandik and Mingtang tribal groups, as well as in Central Australia with the Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara peoples. I'm currently working as an Aboriginal cadet with the University of Adelaide as I complete my undergraduate studies in health and medical science. This exploratory research, funded by the Lowitja Institute, was developed to explore from a strengths-based perspective the Diversity of Contemporary Perspectives of Gender, Gender Roles and Gender Equity in South Australian Aboriginal Communities. Before we introduce the methodology of the study, I would like to acknowledge our two co-researchers on the project. Dominic Guerrera is a Ngati Ghana and Italian man with a background in Aboriginal health, sexual health and health education. Gabby Zizzo is a non-Aboriginal Italian woman with a focus on gender, health and child wellbeing. Dominic and Gabby were the main researchers on the project and were integral to the success of the study. Unfortunately, Dom couldn't be here today. However, Gabby is here via the video call. I would also like to acknowledge all of the support we received from our Aboriginal Advisory Group, the community health organisations, community members, and of course the participants for giving up their time, welcoming us into their lives, and sharing their stories. This study was funded by the Longbottom Institute and was conducted as a partnership between the Aboriginal Health Council of South Australia, the University of Adelaide, and the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. ACSA is a community-controlled health organisation and the peak body for Aboriginal research in South Australia. The Longbottom Institute identified gender and gender equity as priorities for research, and both Longbottom and the research team believed in moving away from a deficit discourse and to focus on a strength-based perspective to share positive stories of Aboriginal femininity and masculinity as described by Aboriginal women and Aboriginal men, and how gender equity might be conceptualised within a strong Aboriginal identity. A major focus throughout the study was that the participants are experts in their own lives. As the research team, we were merely obtaining the stories and perspectives and sharing them in one communal space. The development of the study was done in collaboration with the Aboriginal communities involved to ensure that the research was to be conducted in a culturally safe and respectful way. To ensure this, the Indigenous methodology of yarning circles was used over focus groups or interviews. 13 yarning circles were conducted with 49 participants across 3 locations in South Australia. Participants in our yarning circles included a diverse range of age and gender identities, as well as life experiences. 6 participants identified as LGBTQ. We also conducted a literature review and a policy analysis as part of the project, but today we're just focusing on the results of the yarning circles. The project steering group was cautious that Aboriginal stories need to be told by Aboriginal people. This was done via having Aboriginal membership in the project steering group and engagement throughout the entire process with an Aboriginal advisory group. This group was developed to oversee the project and advise on language, protocol and findings from a cultural context. The group was co-chaired by an Aboriginal man and an Aboriginal woman. The group was diverse in age, gender, Aboriginal heritage and sexual orientation to enhance the cultural safety of the study. In the initial stages of the study, discussions with community members occurred in which a distress protocol was devised to ensure the well-being of all participants. This included allowing the use of mobile phones during the sessions, encouraging parents to bring their children along, and explaining the ability to stop the session at any time without question. In these discussions, it was decided that the best approach to gain meaningful stories was to separate the yarning groups by age and gender. Similarly, our data analysis process involved collective discussions with Dominic, Gabby and myself, which closely resembled the yarning groups. In these discussions, we shared our findings and understandings and interpretations of the discussions in the yarning groups, and we explored any misunderstandings or cultural differences that we might have thought occurred. To further confirm the accuracy of our findings, we went back to the communities and spoke to the same participants about our analysis, gaining feedback on language used and the overall accuracy of our outcomes. Continuing on from a strengths-based perspective, a primary focus of our yarning circles was what makes a strong Aboriginal woman and what makes a strong Aboriginal man. The quotes on the screen represent some of the themes which came out from these discussions. It was quickly apparent that a strong Aboriginal woman is a woman who knows her identity and her culture and is sure of herself. Many participants, both male and female, also described her as being very family-based. as well as being influential in the community and a nurturer who encourages and supports all of the members of the community. It was often discussed that a strong Aboriginal woman is an activist for her people and leads and supports others to do the same. Some women talked about drawing strengths from community advocacy and being an active part of the community, attending events and supporting the local organisations. A primary theme that arose from the women's yarning groups was the concept of resilience, of being able to get up every day and keep going despite the adversity and struggles. Women felt a sense of pride in doing this and were quick to acknowledge other women in the room as strong for also doing this. Similarly, we received beautiful responses on what makes a strong Aboriginal man. A large finding from this question was that a strong Aboriginal man is a carrier of culture, whose strength lies within their knowledge of culture and their ability to share this with the community. Having this knowledge generated a position of leadership and produced pride within the individual. Many people spoke of strong men as those who were good fathers and hard workers for their families and communities. These descriptions of masculinity centred on a broad view of being a provider and included being present and supporting their partners and children. Men recognised these strengths in themselves and felt pride in their abilities to raise and educate not only their own children, but other children in the community. This was also recognised in the discussions around role models, in which men highly regarded other men who were teachers and mentors to themselves. While culture was described as the foundation of Aboriginal identity, participants spoke about how men and women carried culture and cultural knowledge in different domains and practices. For example, some women in one community discussed their activities to foster language revival, but the men engaged in other things like teaching younger boys how to connect with the land through camps and other activities. Both women and men talked about drawing strength from cultural activities. Sometimes these were gendered, but not always. The central theme that was articulated by older participants was the importance of sharing cultural knowledge with younger generations, to support them to hold on to culture and to teach them how to share the knowledge as well.
Thanks very much, Courtney. Hi, everyone. My name is Rumbold. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Adelaide with a strong interest in understanding how the social and structural factors influence women's health. I just want to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and also acknowledge all of the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room and out there in the webosphere, and pay my respects to you all. I present this very much on behalf of our wider research team, which included members from AXA and SAMRI, and of course Gabby and Dom, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I don't think it will surprise anyone that the topics that came up in our discussions around gender, a common theme of those were around caring roles, a work ethic, and the expression of emotions. Men's and women's roles around nurturing formed a really significant component of their gendered identity. Women often discussed mothering as an important aspect of their womanhood, but nurturing or the growing up of kids wasn't always linked to biological parenting. Mothering often extended to the children of their siblings, to grandchildren, to other children in the community. LGBTQ women spoke about fulfilling caring roles through their strong connections to mother-auntie roles for their nieces and nephews. And the ways that men in our group spoke of nurturing emphasised their responsibilities to teach and guide their children and other young people they were connected to. Both men and women also described their work ethic as a significant component of their identity, and that ability to fulfil the role of provider to the family. However, when we talked about the contributions that both men and women made, particularly in relation to men, often the discussions around provider tended to focus on paid work, with not as much acknowledgement of the many ways that both men and women contribute and provide for their family. Most participants also reported that they considered the expression of emotions are gendered, with distinctions about how and when men and women should and shouldn't express emotions. And there was a lot of contradiction in the discussions about when it was appropriate or not appropriate for men and women to express those emotions. Some men reported that they had limited spaces and times where emotions were acceptable. For for example, only being able to express emotions at a funeral or on the football field. The stigma around men's expressions of emotions, particularly vulnerability, was identified by both male and female participants. And some people use language like men were bottling up their emotions, and they linked this strongly to poor social and emotional well-being. But it is important to note that while some men did report that they felt uncomfortable expressing emotions, other men saw crying in particular as a positive aspect, and it strongly aligned with their masculinity. While women reported more freedom around their ability to express emotions, they also spoke about frustration about being viewed as hysterical or overly emotional and being subjected to or being stereotyped in that way. So these articulations of gender strongly linked to connectedness and caring, to being a provider, but also to certain constraints around emotions, reflect an influence of both Aboriginal worldviews, but also Western historical and patriarchal ideals about masculinity and femininity. As Courtney talked about, the importance of role models and sharing and supporting each other through teaching was identified by all of our participants, male and female, across different age groups. These role models were identified as an important source of learning about gender, and important particularly in the early years of life, as the first quote on the screen describes. Named role models included mothers, fathers, elders, and non-Aboriginal community members. And importantly, the role models that our participants named were people that they were connected to, that they had a relationship with. They weren't celebrities or outside leaders. Role models were named and looked up to because of their strong family connections, because they were leaders, they carried themselves with humility, and they actively performed reciprocity in the community. And participants talked about seeking out role models for advice on culture, on life, overcoming hardship, and their careers. So when we asked and tried to generate some discussions directly about gender equity, the discussions revealed that the actual term gender equity often had limited resonance with participants. And this is not surprising, as they are very Western feminist terms. But when we opened up the discussions around fairness and what's fair for men and women, it was apparent that fairness was understood and expressed in terms of shared responsibilities for family and for community. When some of the older women discussed the idea of Aboriginal gender equity, they talked about partnerships now. Younger men validated these ideas about gender equity and fairness involving shared and supportive roles, and they use language like men and women backing each other up and being able to rely on each other. And there was a clear aspiration for women and men to fulfil complementary roles within the family, but also to the wider community. Many of these discussions around fairness and equity focused on parenting responsibilities, and this was viewed as both a source of inequality, but also a place to really anchor efforts to advance gender equity, as the first quote mentions. It's important to note that some participants spoke about generational shifts occurring. So older women spoke about the young men in their families and communities taking on active roles in family life, with no one particular breadwinner identified in their home. Young men also spoke about stepping up to these roles with a blending of roles and responsibilities in their own homes as well. However, many female participants felt that in practice, the daily responsibilities of families more often fell onto them, and some spoke of their frustration at double standards. Some spoke of being expected to look after children from a very early age, and that was an expectation that was not necessarily placed upon male family members. Young female participants, our young mothers in the study, also spoke a lot about being much more scrutinised around their parenting activities than men, and being labelled as bad mothers when they were not present or home, and this wasn't necessarily always subjected to their male partners. Male participants also spoke of double standards, but these focused on custody arrangements, and they expressed their view that in family court matters, their roles as fathers were often viewed as secondary, with mothers automatically seen as being the full-time and primary carer. So in addition to parenting issues, female participants expressed the view that women have been burdened with the responsibilities of holding not only the family together, but also holding the community together. and supporting men. Discussions with female participants and within our feedback workshops included language and talked about focusing on getting men to step up, to heal, to take on responsibility, to gather and to fulfil their roles alongside Aboriginal women. Female participants described this as wanting Aboriginal men to walk beside them. They used language like, "I want men to stand by my side and take up those important positions in the community." Participants also talked about fairness in terms of having that shared responsibility for passing on Aboriginal knowledge, and this included separate domains of culture that are distinct to both women and men, as the second quote illustrates. So a really important distinction in these discussions and descriptions of equity is that the notion of equity was framed around equally fulfilling caring responsibilities for families, communities and culture, rather than redressing unequal power relationships. This included acknowledgement that responsibilities are situated in shared spaces, as well as in distinct gendered spaces that are for men and women only, and that's an important part of Aboriginal cultural life. So these insights suggest that Aboriginal concepts of gender equity are much broader than current Western understandings, which do focus on individual rights to access power and resources. What this highlights is that policies to advance gender equity, if based only on a Western ideal of equity, which is very individualistic and often focuses on issues related to economic security, do not necessarily align with or promote the priorities of Aboriginal women and men. So I just want to spend a little bit of time now discussing what participants identified and viewed as impediments to realising this vision of shared responsibility. As we previously said, all of our discussions around gender and gender roles were focused on, were defined around connections. Having a network with a variety of connections spread across genders was an important and protective factor, as it offered culturally safe support to both men and women. In our discussions, many women spoke about being able to draw on a network of other women in the community and to mobilise their resources to access support. This is a protective factor that they suggested was not available to their male counterparts. This is not to imply that women do not experience displacement and loneliness, but in our study, being disconnected was described as particularly problematic for men. Participants spoke of limited opportunities for men to connect with other men, and this was linked in part to the gendered expectation to conceal emotions. Male participants often spoke about having that support of women, including their mothers, their nanas, their sisters, but both male and female participants consistently talked about Aboriginal men's support systems with other men being absent or restricted. When support was available for men, it was often framed around addressing a deficit or a problem like addiction or rehabilitation. In contrast, in many of our yarning circles with women, the term survivor was brought up, and women spoke in detail about their experiences of survival, how they managed adversity, how they were resilient. They spoke about this as a process of self-reflection, accountability, and shifting away from the persistent impacts of trauma, and often framed their responses as choices. In our yarning circles with men, they didn't talk about resilience or use the same language of survival that women did. And certainly we don't mean this to imply that men are not resilient. Instead, we argue that the lack of discussion among men reflects again that gendered expectation of silence around emotion and coping with trauma. Women talked about and they identified many tools for survival, such as establishing ground rules for their house to ensure it was a safe space, understanding their limits and actively protecting their time when they felt they were overburdened or had a heavy load, as well as accessing those networks of women they had to them for emotional support. And again, this really points to the need for further research to understand gendered experiences of resilience. Experiencing racism was seen as an equaliser between Aboriginal men and women, with racism identified and discussed in almost all of our yarning circles. Participants described racism in the form of gendered stereotypes. For Aboriginal women, this included being labelled as promiscuous, abusive, hysterical and a neglectful mother. Aboriginal men reported being stereotyped as aggressive, alcoholics, vacant fathers and criminals. The impact of these encounters was profound. It made participants feel angry, frustrated, but also hypervigilant, described as a daily battle to prove one's worth. And many agree that the media plays a really large part in propagating these negative stereotypes. In addition, all of our participants who identified as LGBTQ spoke of experiences of transphobia and homophobia from within the Aboriginal community and outside of the community. Verbal abuse, physical violence, isolation from the community, and silencing of their trauma were ways in which homophobia and transphobia manifested. For example, in the above quote, our participant spoke of being assaulted by a family member and then silenced, leaving her without resolution and feeling isolated. In doing so, these actions also reinforced and prioritised very harmful notions of masculinity. Experiences of homophobia and transphobia created hypervigilance for our LGBTQ participants, and this was evident in the way they spoke about their interactions with their family and when attending cultural events. But these participants spoke of a strong need to remain connected to their culture and to their family, and they actively forged these connections. To avoid discrimination, some would put in place protective measures. For example, in the above quote, it is a bit long, you can see that our participant desperately wanted to know about her mother's country, and to do that, when she went out on country, she wore a fake wedding ring to avoid unwanted relationships and questioning about her status. Many LGBTQ participants spoke of creating safe spaces within their homes for themselves and peers, giving them control over who could enter those spaces. Participants also spoke of gender disparities in employment. Some suggested that women actually have greater access to sustained employment, particularly in rural communities where health, education and care-based industries are a key source of employment. The predominance of women in these caring positions, and these positions which are caring-based, reflects that reproduction of those historical norms about what is women's work and what's men's work, as the quote on the slide shows. However, participants also identified that the requirement for criminal history checks was a major impediment to men securing employment. Both women and men identified minor petty crimes such as unpaid fines, often committed during youth, had limited opportunities for men to work as adults in industries that involved caring for the community. Our study also demonstrated that Aboriginal women are not immune from the gender pay disparities that we see in the wider community, with both male and female participants identifying this problem, as the second quote also demonstrates. So I just want to sum up by saying, in this study, women articulated Aboriginal femininity as knowing culture, nurturing their family and the community, and being resilient. Men articulated masculinity as knowing and teaching culture, supporting family and being a role model. And the key underlying theme of these depictions of gender is connections. Gender equity was conceptualised as walking together in family life and in the community, in fulfilling cultural obligations that may be gendered but also interdependent. And it's important to note that our discussions focused on shared responsibilities, not men and women necessarily accessing the same spaces. Both women and men articulated this vision of shared responsibilities, but there was a variety of views about what happens in reality. Importantly, some spoke of a younger generation being more equal, but some women also felt that they bore an unequal responsibility for both family and community activities. These women wanted men to be more present, more connected to family and to community life. And we argue that this requires more than just individualistic responses. So I just want to finish with some discussion points. So this was an exploratory project, so we do not prescribe solutions. We know that these need to be community-led. But our findings do point to a number of points that need further discussion. Both women and men spoke of discrimination, reflecting distinct experiences of the intersection of race and gender, but also race, gender and sexual orientation. So this reiterates that strategies to advance gender equity for Aboriginal peoples must be considered within a broader agenda to address the structures that perpetuate systemic racism and marginalisation. We argue that realising the right to self-determination is the foundation to empower Aboriginal men, women and gender diverse individuals to fulfil their cultural and family obligations. And that was the aspiration for gender equity that participants in our studies described. In addition to structural change, attitudinal change is required. So we need those continued strategies to counteract racial and gender stereotypes and promote those positive role models which many of our participants identified as essential for strengthening cultural identity. And we need those strategies to be targeted to mainstream society and Aboriginal communities. Our findings that feelings of displacement and disconnection disproportionately affected men, they need confirmation and further exploration to understand ways to counteract that. There are many good things happening in communities like men's sheds, and we need to build on those existing community activities and that expertise that's there to support men to reconnect to their community life and families. The experiences of LGBTQ people in our study also show that they really worked hard to maintain and forge those connections to culture, but often they felt silenced. Much more needs to be done to understand and raise awareness of the experiences of needs of LGBTQ people and the contribution that they are already making to culture and community. And finally, our findings, we have to say, reflect the yarns that we had in the 3 participating communities. How other communities conceptualise gender equity may be different, and the gendered experiences of men and women may also be different. So we think this points to the need for a much larger study, potentially a national study, to understand whether this view of gender equity is shared outside of our communities.
In keeping with the strengths outlook of the presentation, we wanted to finish on the notion of Aboriginal empowerment. This is the same way that we finished all of the yarning circles, by asking people, how do you empower yourself? The responses that we received were incredible. As you can see, the quotes on the screen present the importance of being connected to one another and supporting and lifting each other up. The quote by the woman portrays the empowerment and strength that she pulls from herself and how she shares that with the community. It is empowerment through strengthening connections to culture, to women, to men, and to the community. Thank you.
First off, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Marlene Longbottom. I'm a Yuin woman from the south coast of New South Wales. I come from a mission called Roseby Park, or Geringa, which is about 20 minutes outside of Nowra on the eastern seaboard. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge country, the land of the Wurundjeri people, of the Cullen Nation, the elders past and present, and I'd also like to pay our respects to our fellow CI, Dr. Tamara McKean, who couldn't be here with us. She has some sorry business, and we wish her family all the love and comfort at this time. So we're ready to get. So with our project, the first response, we have a number of Aboriginal community controlled health services that are partners with this. They're all located in New South Wales. We have a very large research team, and that's because of our networks and knowing each other and each other's work. So I need to acknowledge the 4 services: Katunga, which is on the south coast of New South Wales, the Illawarra Aboriginal Medical Service, which is in the Illawarra and Wollongong, Yurin, which is on the central coast of New South Wales, and Wominda Aboriginal Women's Health and Welfare Organisation in Nowra, also on the south coast of New South Wales. And our partners are with the George Institute, and which is where Patricia is located, or University of New South Wales, and where I'm located at the Australian Health Services Research Institute at the University of Wollongong. How we came about with the idea of this project was through the PhD that I completed, as well as some other discussions that we had been having between our networks and around the services, and basically it kind of grew out of the PhD. What I found in my PhD was that Aboriginal women were unlikely to report violence to the police. And if they did, it was only in severe cases. And there were other reasons. There was racialised and gendered issues around that, and the child protection notifications. So the trust and rapport that the police that services had or didn't have with community was a major factor in why Aboriginal women wouldn't report violence. So in the PhD, what happened was we found, or that I found, was that Aboriginal women are more comfortable going to Aboriginal medical services, and in particular the relationship with the doctor. One of the participants stated that she felt more comfortable with the doctor to disclose the violence to the doctor because that was there was a particular level of confidentiality. So that's kind of how this grant has grown out of that. We identified that there was a need to look at the service systems and how community organisations like Aboriginal Medical Services are really significant places where violence can be disclosed in a safe and culturally and trauma-informed place that's not going to stigmatise them, that they're not going to have to retell their story over and over again and cause re-traumatisation. So we looked at what needs, what the services need to do in order to respond and to advocate for Aboriginal women. We looked at the enormity of disclosure and the re-traumatisation that can actually happen as a result of retelling their stories. And also the risk to personal safety for Aboriginal women who came forward to report the violence, and really just being there to validate and hear Aboriginal women's stories. I think that's probably the most important thing about when someone's coming forward. They're in a really vulnerable situation, and it's that first response. It's really that thing of how you respond in that moment in time can actually lead a woman to getting the support she needs or her dying. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. So a bit of background as well on me. So Marlene and I started working on this project almost 2 years ago. I'm a research fellow at the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of New South Wales, and I'm also an honorary fellow at the George Institute for Global Health, and that's where this project began in partnership with Marlene. So Tamara and I are both based at the George Institute. So my background is in looking at health outcomes for women who are impacted by violence, but also young people. And prior to starting this project, I'd done a coronial review looking at violent deaths of women across Australia. And what was really obvious is that the service system response, there's major gaps, and particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at was what's happening at the service level, but also what's happening at a policy level, and also what's happening internationally. So we won't go into too much detail about the other aspects of the project today. We want to focus on the interviews, but just briefly, we also conducted a policy scoping review to investigate how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are experiencing violence, are considered in national and state policy in Australia. We wanted to consider how policy acknowledges working across sectors, intersectionality, and culturally safe care and systems, including considerations of sovereignty and self-determination. So for this review, we looked at Australian and national state policy. We excluded inactive policy, but particularly we looked at policy that considered primary health care and family violence.
So following this search, we reviewed 90 policies and we retained a further 6 for analysis. And that's a paper that we've almost finished drafting. For the systematic review, we looked at the international literature and we wanted to investigate how trauma-informed care has been implemented in a way that's culturally safe for First Nations women experiencing violence. And we wanted to see how this has been integrated within primary healthcare settings. So our inclusion criteria was First Nations women, services providing culturally safe or trauma-informed care within primary healthcare settings, and specifically to address family or intimate partner violence. And we looked across a 20-year time period. I won't go into too much about that here. And then the final aspect of this project, which we'll focus on today, is the yarning interviews. So we talked to staff from the partner ARCHOs, and we tried to talk to a really wide range of staff, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workers and practitioners, clinical staff including general practitioners and practice nurses, early childhood nurses, midwives, mental health clinicians and nurses, the integrated care team, the social and emotional wellbeing team, the ear and eye team, and the drug and alcohol team. And we also talked to management staff as well. And we asked staff about their experiences and insight into trauma-informed care. We wanted to understand what it meant to them to work in a service that was trauma-informed and what it meant to deliver trauma-informed responses. And we also wanted to ask about areas that they'd like to develop within their practice, and also resources that would support them to do that. Once we'd done this, Marlene and I came together to review the data and do some initial analysis. And then we brought particular staff from the services, and the services nominated who that staff would be, together for a knowledge translation workshop just towards the end of last year in October. And this was a way for us to share some of the emerging results, and then to also have a yarning circle where staff from the different services could sort of delve deeper into some of the issues that really stood out as being important. Oh,
what we found was really different in terms of people's views with the clinical teams, as opposed to those teams that might have had case management roles or functions. So there was kind of like the clinical team were looking at their clinical activities, and the case management team were looking after the social health type of mental health, court support, things like that. So we were wanting to have a look at how that internally, how the systems internally worked. We also had discussions around understanding the context and the impact of colonisation, cumulative and historical trauma, as well as current day trauma, and those compounding access to services and seeking help. Aboriginal women's lives are complex, and we needed to understand that. So unpacking racism was a big issue, sexism, sexual orientation, issues around things like that. So we and also around disability and those types of things as well. So we looked at a lot of different angles in terms of what an Aboriginal woman could present with, and how each of these services teams within the service could or would respond. The trauma-informed and the culturally informed standpoint really resonated across the services. And there's a really, really big need to make sure that even in the clinical setting, that the GPs and the registered nurses, that they're coming from a trauma and culturally informed standpoint, because that's quite often where, or could be, where an Aboriginal woman might disclose violence. So we looked at the ways that Aboriginal women can enter the services, and it was quite interesting when we unpacked this with the staff. They could be coming through the GP clinic, they could be coming through the case management team, they could be coming through the family support team, or through the playgroup type of programs that each of the services run. So the services provide comprehensive, integrated and wraparound services to the community, and they identified in order for violence to be discussed or disposed, there was a really big need to ensure that trusting relationships were developed if they weren't already existing. And how that operated was there might have been a woman coming in for, say, a health check, and in that health check some sort of discussion is disclosed to the doctor or one of the nurses or one of the health workers, Aboriginal health workers in that process. So then it was following the organisational procedures about getting support for that woman through the case management team. So we had a look at the referral pathways between the teams and how that worked as well. The Aboriginal family health worker role in health consultations was important for supporting clients, and also recognising non-verbal cues, or body language in particular. That was kind of one of the big issues that Aboriginal women disclosed to me in the PhD around microaggressions, racial microaggressions and body language came out as a big impediment if an Aboriginal woman is disclosing violence and the person taking the story is rolling their eyes. So it's really important that Aboriginal health workers are part of these discussions as well, where possible, given the communities are tight-knit and the kinship structure. So also unpacking that if there was, say, the person perpetrating the violence, they had family in the service, how they would counteract that sort of thing, those sorts of issues as well. So the integration between the clinical and case management team prevents re-traumatisation and the retelling of client stories. I think that was one of the biggest factor about why Aboriginal women do not want to engage with different systems, where they have to go and constantly retell their story. It's bringing out that trauma again, and then having to deal with the multiple microaggressions that come out through those conversations. We identified key staff in each of the services who were the go-to people and who they were for supporting the women, and particularly where they could go in times of crisis to get some help. This relationship between the clinical and the case management staff was vital to getting the woman being responsive to the woman's needs, and the working relationship of working well together and making sure that there's a seamless referral pathway. There was a need. We identified a need to foster awareness and engagement of trauma-informed practice, and some of the participants described trauma-informed practice or culturally informed practice, but they didn't actually say that's what they did. They didn't give it that label. And the GPs were considered to be key people by the clinical staff because of that patient-doctor confidentiality. It's one-on-one, with communities being very closely related. It's a conversation or a space where a conversation can be had, where the woman can disclose the violence and then a plan can be made if she needs to, like a safety plan or things like that, where planning needs to occur. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So Marlene's described how things worked within the service, but equally important was how the service then had those networks within the wider community. And the services all described how a lot of time and resources went into building those networks with different community agencies, but in particular with police. These were the main ones: police, housing, facts, and justice health. And one of the things that also came out in the knowledge translation workshop is that the time and the resources that goes into building these networks really isn't accounted for in key performance indicator objectives that are dictated by primary health networks. And it was something that was so important and vital to their work, but it really hasn't been recognised in the funding models. And that was something that staff were really distressed about. One of the other issues, despite being able to develop these and maintain these really strong partnerships, staff described witnessing racism directed at clients very frequently, but also directed at ARCHO staff too. So when they were dealing potentially with, for example, facts, having their qualifications questioned and, just having that feeling that there was a lot of undermining going on. Government services and involvement can be re-traumatising for clients, and staff at ARCHOs were acutely aware of this and went, the extra mile to make sure that staff didn't experience that re-traumatisation. And again, that wasn't something that's accounted for in their day-to-day key performance objectives, but it's a huge part of their work. And they actually felt that unofficially they're tasked with fostering cultural competence in the wider community. And it's a burden that falls to staff within ARCHOs to make sure that other services are behaving in culturally safe ways. And that's a real issue. Yeah.
Okay. So with identifying key staff or the go-to staff, it was really important the services actually identified that there's certain qualities of people that they look for to work in this space. And there was multiple levels in which I was looking for key people with specific skills and possibly qualifications and the networks, but it was also about how the service responded to them as staff. Making sure that, they felt valued for their work and their contribution, and they had built strong connections with the community and clients. This recruitment process that ARCHOs go through in terms of trying to select the most appropriate people, particularly when you're coming from an Aboriginal worldview, quite often what can happen is non-Aboriginal people can come into the space and bring a worldview that's quite traumatic in certain settings. So there is a really big need to make sure that there's a bicultural or a two worldview, that when you're working with Aboriginal communities, in particular these 4 services, that the Aboriginal worldview is centred. Just also the other recognition of the other qualities that staff have, so their commitment, their presence, their warmth, just their general caring. It helps to make sure that it's a safe space for Aboriginal women to come forward and report violence. And in doing so, we had discussions around burnout. So we wanted to make sure that we discussed this to see how the services addressed issues where staff could actually burn out, because you want to keep the good staff that are really passionate, but you also want to keep them safe. The thing about this is quite often when services are employing Aboriginal people, and particularly in the violence space, a lot of staff might have already experienced violence themselves or some type of trauma. So it's really important to understand that when recruitment happens, that there's mechanisms in place for the staff. And that's also around staff setting boundaries around themselves and around their work. We discussed this at length at the knowledge translation workshop about keeping each other safe, keeping themselves safe, but then also keeping communities safe. And it was identified about being realistic about what they could offer community, and also reminding community that they're mandatory reporters, so child protection issues. Often the go-to people are kind of overloaded with casework. So it's really important to be mindful of the level of intensity of the work, as well as the number of people that they might be supporting in case management. So it's quite, when you start to unpack all of these issues around what services are provided, we've also got to be careful about the staff's wellbeing as well. This supervision and self-care is an important part of that. So clinical supervision in particular helped with the vicarious trauma, as well as the burnout. And that's probably one of the biggest things I think that Aboriginal community control health services could employ or use more often or more frequently is the use of clinical supervision and also cultural supervision. Supervision was hugely beneficial and that assisted in the maintaining and keeping those boundaries with clients, and it provided a strong and supportive team working with strong leadership, and that was also important. And you know, the participants also described areas or challenges of self-care. So putting themselves first sometimes was a little bit difficult, particularly when they had families. So it was a big area that, you know, we spoke to them about.
So we asked staff about any training or resources that they felt would be helpful. And one of the things that was really interesting is that because we did ask, you know, what are your understandings around trauma-informed care, one of the things that staff did identify was to have more formalised training in this area. I think the training that Marlene's mentioned about cultural supervision, this was something that came up as a resource that staff identified as important, and important not only for themselves but for the service, but also for the wider community as well. They felt that resources that could be developed that would be able to be disseminated more widely would be really useful. The other type of training that staff were really enthusiastic about was around mental health, and staff felt that they were working within that space, but their training hadn't ever really been formalised, and that's where they'd sort of rely on those go-to people within the service, but they also identified that they were keen to have some of that training themselves too.
And an interesting component to the training was it came out at the knowledge translation workshop around what's called imperfect allies. And that's where whiteness is discussed, as well as white privilege, and understanding that when you're working in a setting like an Aboriginal community control service, that there's a different dynamic and a different worldviews, and people bring in their privilege that they carry. So they're conversations that are had in the services that are really useful. So we did the knowledge translation workshop, and these preliminary results of the project were provided back to the services. And the pictures see on the right, we also received a top-up of our grant to do a digital scribe. So we're working through the methodology around how that worked and how we interpret the data that was produced from the knowledge translation workshop. It was one way of triangulating the data, the individual interviews that we did, and the yarning circles, as well as you know, the data from the digital scribe. So some of the themes that we looked at in terms of the knowledge translation workshop and the yarning circles was the service integration, workforce and community intersections.
This is a busy slide.
Yeah, it's a busy slide.
So this is from the knowledge translation workshop, and you can see we've got one of the pictures there. So the role of the doctor came out really strongly in the individual yarning interviews that we did, but also within the knowledge translation workshop. And it was a little bit different how it came out in the knowledge translation workshop. It was sort of, there was some acknowledgement that the role of the doctor was very critical, but it was also, it highlighted how important it was to have the right GPs in the services, and to have GPs that were in the services for a long period of time, and rather than having a quick turnover, because that trust really needed to be there to be able to have the benefit of that confidential one-on-one consultation. There was many people identified that doctors really don't seem to have a trauma-informed model, and they haven't really received that type of training. And some of the quotes that we had, you know, there was one doctor who referred to staff in the service as subordinates, which, you know, it creates a really unsafe working environment for staff as well. And that was something that also came out in the Yarning Circle workshop too, that the trauma-informed practice doesn't just extend to the clients, it's for the staff too, and providing that space where people can debrief when they need to, in real time, and it's not that they have to wait to have clinical supervision in a week or a month. It's that got that wraparound support for staff as well. And I think we've sort of talked about minimising re-traumatisation in clinical settings and how important that is too.
I think the other thing that came out with the GPs or with clinicians is that the Aboriginal women have multiple burdens, multiple complexities, and the stories are layered. You know, it's focused on the women and the family and the children and things like that, and you know, ACHOs and clinicians really try their best to address all of those issues. However, when you have clinicians who aren't used to a worldview like an Aboriginal worldview, they can bring their own racism and their own biases. And that's actually what can stop a woman from reporting violence if there's an interaction, again through non-verbal cues such as microaggressions around racism and cultural and gender issues. So the role of the doctor is really important, and the clinicians, it can be supportive, or it could also be the flip side as being re-traumatising experience.
So the language, we've sort of touched on this as well, but this is where while people may not use the term trauma-informed, they are providing a trauma-informed practice. And it was really interesting to sort of unpack what that meant for different types of clinicians, whether they came from a clinical background or whether they came from more of a social worker, case manager background, and then also between the different services too. Was really interesting. So it was one of those things where, so this sort of sums it up. I'm definitely aware of it, but I don't use that term. I use the word trauma a lot, but I don't use trauma-informed care.
It was important for us to, and this is where we'll finish the presentation, we wanted to make sure that we ended on a positive note. We didn't want to be seen to be bashing the clinicians or anything like that, but as just one of those things where we know Aboriginal people know what they need and how they want to access services. So when you come from an Aboriginal worldview and a trauma-informed, culturally informed standpoint, it can actually make disclosure of violence a little bit more easier. And there is tricky relationships in communities that we have to negotiate and we have to manage. But the services that have participated in this project have really worked through all those types of things. And they believe, you know, they're the next generation, so they've got to look after their communities, and it's their responsibility So yeah, it's bringing it, centering the Aboriginal worldview and Aboriginal women's voices in this space so that they're validated and heard.
Thank you so much to our presenters, to Alice and Courtney, Trish and Marlene. So now we'll open up the session to questions and answers. So no one's indicated as yet that they had a question they wanted to ask. Just to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, so let me know if you've got a question. I can unmute you so you can pose a question yourself. As well as have the opportunity to, I suppose, build off of the response. So is there anyone with any questions or any feedback for the presenters? You can just send through a queue or something through the group chat and then I can facilitate that. No. Okay, no one's sending through any questions. Yeah, I mean, you know, one thing that I was thinking, you know, we were looking at the overarching narrative, I suppose, for this webinar being around the ways in which the dominant stereotypes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, how those stereotypes impact on experiences of seeking healthcare. Could the presenters speak to that a little bit more, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's one for me. Yeah, it is the way in which Aboriginal women are perceived in the community as well as by service providers can actually really impact how they access a service, whether they do or don't or not. So like in your project, you identified the stereotype around what I call the angry black woman, and that came out as well, like those types of stereotypes and the racialised discourse around Aboriginal women's humanity and femininity and things like that. So it's when the Aboriginal woman is coming to get support from a service and they're feeling like they're not being heard or valued or listened to, based on the microaggressions that are coming from a behavioural or attitudinal way. It could be someone's having a really bad day and they're just not with it, or looking at their watch even. That can be interpreted as an experience that they don't really want to engage with that service. So that places them in a distrusting situation. They don't want to go back to that service. And in the case of the police, that was kind of a frequent talking point around how Aboriginal women engage with police who are there to protect. So the services, health services, actually advocate and intervene quite a lot to make sure that, you know, Aboriginal women don't have to retell their story. And so it's that support and that advocacy, but also the cultural and trauma-informed translation, I guess, about how you know, they work in with these networks of people, of service providers, and just how crucial Aboriginal community-controlled health services are.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Okay, still not got any questions coming through.
Alex, I have a question.
Beautiful, thank you.
So is the next step for you guys to turn those, to produce resources, or and will they be widely available?
Yeah.
Or
yeah. We're still working through the analysis and the write-up, so we're busily trying to get the write-up done and that sort of thing, but also going back to the individual services to provide some feedback and working out, like, what is it that what do you need in this space? and what are the resources and the education types of resources. So quite obviously, one thing that's standing out is doctor training. So particularly around maybe getting into some of the universities and talking about, well, are you training doctors around trauma and culturally informed care? So the packages, there'll be things that we do for the services as well as advocate for change elsewhere.
And do you think in terms of the resources, do you think they are very community specific, or do you think there's a standardised approach that would be relevant across many communities?
I think the idea would be to develop resources that can be locally and culturally contextualised to the community. So there might be elements that are relevant to the communities in Eastern Australia that aren't relevant to Central or Western Australia. So the idea of developing resources and assuming, a generic resource will cover each of the communities, that's not realistic. So it would be more about developing a suite of tools that can be locally and culturally contextualised. And also we hope to be able to talk about issues that affect the LGBTQ community as well. That's one of the big questions we had. How do you support people from the LGBTQ community?
And that sort of relates to some of the issues that you identified in your project. So it would be interesting to hear more about that from you as well. But that was one of the questions that we asked staff. So we asked about how staff felt their particular groups of people might have different needs. And one of the groups of people, for example, we asked about older women, and people had a lot of information to share about the needs of older women and how they approached older women. And particular services within the community for older women, and similar for women with a disability or caring for a child with a disability. And then when we asked about the LGBTQI community, it really stunned people. They sort of said, oh, well, we treat everyone the same, and then you could see them starting to reflect on it and say, well, actually, I'm not sure what particular services there might be available, and it's definitely an area that we need to look at more.
Yeah, so I think, do you want to?
I'll just add.
So I think that was a really strong need identified in our study. In fact, one of our recommendations are that we need to find ways to support services to be able to ask about the specific needs of LGBT individuals. It was really clear that there is a lot of silence around their needs, but also their important roles in the community. Our work was really showing that many people are forging culture, but having to do lots of things to protect themselves and compromise. Also, they're supporting many of their peers, but health services haven't necessarily caught up to that. And Dom, who's a researcher, his area is background working. His working background is sexual health, and he, strongly sees that need all the time. But it's really absent from current service models.
It is, and it's something that we've kind of looked. Over the last couple of years of working together, it's always a conversation point. How can we ensure that everyone that comes to, particularly an ACHO, is safe, that they can get the support that they need despite whatever their needs are. And I think that's where ACHOs in particular are ahead of some of GP services, for example. I think a lot of the ways in which Aboriginal community controlled health services operate in that holistic manner, but also there's still work to be done. But it's how do we do this in a safe way so that people can actually get the health care that they need.
Gabby, who's also online, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm just... there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yep. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Gabby.
Yeah, you can hear me. Cool. Yeah, I think I would support what Alice said about the silencing of the LGBT participants and that coming out as a strong recommendation our findings. Interesting, Marlene, what you were just saying about the need for the resources to be locally and culturally contextualised. So we've just presented the findings for this. I'm sorry for my lateness, but I was just presenting the gender project to our local board. We were speaking about how our project might need to consider more diverse views of gender across Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, and they said that they didn't think we would get that many different findings, which I found quite interesting. It was their view that if we explored more locations in South Australia or beyond, that we wouldn't get that many more different findings, and that they suspected it would be more important for us to drill down deeper rather than broader. I just thought that was quite an interesting comment to feedback, considering that, you know, what you're saying about things need to be culturally and locally contextualised, and how that we might apply that to our, you know, steps moving forward.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about the resources and the development of packages or things that can come out of these projects, I think there's elements that will work in certain communities uniformly, but then there'll be things that it won't. And we can't assume that what's going to work. Even when you look at my community where I come from, we have communities within communities. Yeah. So when we talk about being locally and culturally contextualised, it's about what are the stories to this place, and what's important to the cultural context of this place, wherever that place is and those spaces. I think it's really important to understand that, but I think also we need to also move with the currency of who makes up our communities. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. It's not this heteronormative view of that's a patriarchal view, that it's this male-female binary. So we need to make sure that what services provide or what we do is actually reflective of the current makeup of our communities. Mm-hmm. And then you see the silencing of women or LGBTQ community people, you know, mothers who are supporting children with disabilities, or they may have some sort of, disabilities themselves. So it's like, we really have to look at those things and how those power structures can actually alienate people and isolate people. That then will impede them from even reaching out and getting support. So they could be staying stuck in relationships or in violent situations because they don't want to disclose any further things that they could be judged about. So when we talk about the complexity of violence, that's like, it's just not settling this crisis, this moment of crisis now. It's okay, how do we look at the systems and those types of things? And we have to be mindful that our communities are very diverse, whether that's on the East Coast, Central Australia, or the West Coast. So we need to just keep all that in mind as well.
So how will say the findings from the Gender Equity Project, how will that feed into your work?
Good question. So I guess we're quite interested in exploring, the topic of this webinar was around ways to support women and families, but a strong finding that came out of our research was that it was also about lifting up men. So I just wondered, did you have many perspectives from men in your study?
We did, and we had a number of men participate in the interviews, and the men's role in families came out as a really strong point. So we realised that, violence just doesn't happen to Aboriginal women. It's also Aboriginal men or Indigenous men, and Indigenous women. So the space that we're in about looking at the whole of the family, that's kind of like where to next, sort of what do we do for the whole of the family. And with the men's interviews, they were really strong about similar themes that came out from what is Aboriginal masculinity, and what is a father's role and what is an uncle's role. So it's like and the men that are in these services really take that role responsibly as community men as well as fathers themselves. So it was really interesting to unpack that as well. So, you know.
And it was sort of stuff described a challenge around making sure that men were brought along and kept involved in these conversations, but also that women had time alone with clinicians to have those private conversations that they needed to have. And it was always about keeping that balance, and also making sure that men coming to the clinic, whether they were coming with themselves or with their family, had men within the clinic that they could see too. It was important, wasn't it? That,
And one of the participants spoke about something that happened in the service where a woman came into the clinic and the violent partner was with her. So what happened was the clinic got in touch with the case management team, and then they got things moving for the woman, whilst also then referring and supporting the man to services that he needed. So this is their description of what a trauma-informed response and culturally informed response was, understanding that quite often, you know, people in relationships, they don't want the relationship to end, they just want the violence to end. And sometimes relationships need to end, but it's like understanding that people in relationships have different needs. So whether that's gender needs or health needs or whatever, and just being responsive to that.
And keeping people engaged. Making sure that those men are going to keep coming back to the service and that it's a safe space for them.
So, and it's also about not putting the individual onus on the men, you know. Realising that also a system that requires the balance of men and, you know, to promote the balance of men and women. So.
Yeah, and that discussion came out again in some of our interviews around women who are violent. And the role of sometimes the role of, if violence has been experienced over a period of time, the role of the person who perpetrates violence can actually flip. So it's not necessarily the woman who's the survivor, the victim survivor. Sometimes it could be that relationship and that violence flips and she fights back. So, and then that then creates a whole new dynamic, which is something that I saw frequently in my PhD.
I have a question actually for everyone listening. My name is Emma Somerville. I work at the Literature Institute and I'm lucky enough to be here in the room. I was just thinking when you were talking about risk of traumatization in changing GPs and that kind of thing. I was actually thinking of the newly introduced My Health record. And I guess my question, it's just a quick one, would be, did that kind of come in to your thoughts when you think about that, or how that could possibly help in that happening in future, or how you think that would fit in with maybe preventing that occurring if the records, or how that would work around cultural safety as well? You know, it's quite a sensitive kind of.
So a disclosure is made, and then My Health record records that a record or something is. A marker is put on that record to note that. Is that what you're asking? Sorry.
Well, I don't really know too much about what is entailed in the My Health record, but from what I understand is that there will be some kind of record.
Yeah, I have my own opinions about.
Yeah, it's a very controversial topic.
It's a very controversial topic.
That was just what popped into my head. I wonder how that's going to change.
Controversies about it because people are concerned about who would have access. You know, beyond their general practitioner or the next general practitioner they see.
And I don't know if the legislation has changed, but there's quite possible racial profiling that can happen.
Absolutely.
If you have, particularly if there might be some family law matters, and a lawyer wants to assert or use the legislation to its fullest capacity, obtaining medical health records could actually pose or put a risk at people's identity and their confidentiality, particularly if they're, you know, taking medications, you know, for mental health conditions or, you know, that sort of stigmatisation. I think that's probably where I'm coming from and you know, the use of it by systems like police and facts, and can that happen? So they're kind of the things that we don't really know what could be done with this My Health record, because it links so much data. So it's something that I'm kind of watching and just looking and thinking through a little bit. But that's kind of my initial perspective on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.